Well, today, ladies and gentlemen, in this video, we're going to be talking about arguably, if not definitively, my favorite model of a guitar of all time, that is a Les Paul. And honestly, guys, as much as I love it, it is far from perfect. I figured I would just tell a little story, or a few stories, I guess, about why I kind of hate the Les Paul a little bit. Let's get into it. So what is going on, everybody? Thank you so much for joining me for today's video. My name is Ray. I'm a guitar player here on YouTube, and right off the bat, this is not the type of content that I think that you think that this is. If I got that right. Basically, what I'm trying to say is, this is not a bashing video. This is not a negativity video. Yes, I'm going to speak negatively about the Les Paul, but I figured I would just, be honest with you, be honest with myself, say, hey, there's some things with the Les Paul that I'm not really a fan of. But then at the end of the video, I'll kind of spin it and I'll just, sprinkle some positivity on everything that I'm about to say, okay? And before I share everything, feel free to leave your thoughts down below in the comments about if you play Les Paul or if you're a fan of the Les Paul, what are some things that you wish you could change about it? Because with anything, I think we can be honest with ourselves. Any guitar is not perfect, at least in my opinion. There's always something we could highlight. And the Les Paul, I think, generally speaking, has some things that are, kind of perfectly imperfect. So anyway, if you want to play along, put all your thoughts down below in the comments section. I'll meet you down there as well, okay? And last thing I just have to say, if you're brand new to my channel, please consider hitting that subscribe button, alright? So with that all out of the way, let's start talking about the things that I kind of hate about the Les Paul. So first one on the list has to deal with the pickups. The stock pickups in a Gibson Les Paul or Epiphone Les Paul just really aren't that high output, generally speaking. I'm talking about burst buckers and pro buckers, you know what I mean? Like, those really just don't get the job. I believe these are Alnico 2 magnets and Alnico 2 pickups. They just really don't have that punch and that clarity and that just overall ferocity that I personally gravitate towards. Now, take everything I say with a grain of salt, as I am a metal player. So like, the stock pickups, they just really don't do it for me. That's all. Second one on the list has to deal with the heel joint where the neck meets the body. Now, there have been several different instances of Les Pauls, Epiphone and Gibson alike, where they've tried to kind of reinvent this design. I think we can, generally speaking, this is kind of a design flaw. Any time you got to get past, like, say, the 15th fret, you're grabbing so much of the guitar, and it's just really not ergonomically pleasing, and it's just not really practical. Like, you got this big giant thing, this big giant chunk of wood in your hand, and it's really just kind of hard to play in the upper fret access. You've seen like the Les Paul Modern and the Epiphone Prophecy and just like the HPs, I think they're called at one point, where like they tried to like carve it away and try to get rid of some of this big giant blockiness. And in my opinion, they've just never really gotten it right yet. There's a lot of other companies that really just kind of make that heel joint very seamless. I'm looking at like Solar guitars, and I think maybe like some Epiphones some ESPs, pardon me. I think they just do a better job at like kind of just making this a little bit more, easier to play. So this is certainly something that I kind of hate with the Les Paul, the Gibson Les Paul or Epiphone Les Paul. The next thing I'm not a huge fan of, I kind of hate, is the scale length, 24 3/4 inch. Now, I'm going to contradict myself real quick because I love that scale length with like standard tuning and drop D. That's like, I think, just like really slinky. This guitar is tuned to standard right now. It's just like really slinky and a lot of wiggle room with, a higher tuned guitar. But again, being a metal player, whenever you start to down tune anything past drop C sharp, in my opinion, is really hard to intonate and really hard to keep in tune, and you got to use big giant bridge cables for guitar strings. So like a drop B Les Paul, in my opinion, just, you can kind of get away with it. Some people do it. I know a lot of people do it. But for me personally, it's just something that I would just rather grab a 25.5 inch scale. Yeah, just the scale length, just again, for a metal player, doesn't really do it for me. Next up on the list is the tuning stability, or lack thereof. So now this is my 2021 Gibson Les Paul Standard. I have since swapped out the tuners. Now I have some hip shot locking tuners. And this guitar stays in tune much better compared to the stock tuners that were on this guitar. That G string was just was giving me a tough time, you know what I mean? That thing is impossible to stay in tune. And I think any guitar with a 3-and-3, 3 per side headstock shape, you'll certainly find a lot of problems because that break angle with the strings is really, really severe. Yeah, just, I think the tuning stability is kind of a design flaw. There's certainly ways to get around it. Again, locking tuners, for example, and a proper setup will certainly, get you in a better ballpark. But I think we can all kind of agree, not necessarily just with Gibson and Epiphone, but anytime you have a big giant break angle at the nut, it really just causes some problems for tuning, you know what I mean? All right, next up on the list pertains only to Gibson guitars, and that is the price. I'm kind of kicking myself as like a 12-year-old because I decided back then when I first started playing guitar, when I was 11/12, I liked Gibson Les Pauls. Yeah, that was what I decided that I thought was the coolest guitar of all time. And I'm mad at myself because it just so happens that's like, you know, arguably the most expensive production guitar on the market. But in all seriousness, man, yeah, just like anybody who wants a Gibson, man, like you gotta save up a lot of money. You know, these are actually cheaper nowadays. Back in the day, like 3 to 5 years ago, whatever, like the Les Paul standard was like over $3 grand, and they've since chopped that price like by a third nowadays. But still, I don't care who you are, man, that's a lot of money. So again, for somebody who like is dreaming of a Les Paul, a Gibson Les Paul, a real Les Paul, it's kind of hard to get, you know what I mean? And that's a shame. But Epiphones are certainly on the up and up, and they're getting better and better as time goes on. Like I love the Prophecy, I love my Silverburst Les Paul Custom. You know, they're getting better, but you know, for a real one, you gotta save up a lot of money. And the last thing I hate about the Les Paul is a bit of a hot take, but it's the relevancy of the Les Paul. And let me explain. Prior to 2019, when Gibson rebranded themselves and they made the 50s and 60s Les Pauls, they were really struggling to create like a modern and relevant Les Paul. They were creating the HPs, they created, I think, like the Les Paul Modern or something, where like it was like asymmetrical neck, just a really kind of sculpted heel joint, locking tuners, a whole bunch of push-pull pots and dip switches and all this. And I can't remember if that was a Modern. I know the standards had those as well. Anyway, what I'm trying to say is like they're really, in my opinion, struggling to like keep up with the times. They were trying to keep up with the times, but the Gibson customers were not responding positively to those changes, right? So they went back to the 50s and 60s kind of brand and idea, and that's what, you know, made people excited about Gibson again. It's like, yes, they're doing it, you know, they're doing what they've always been doing, and you know, now people love them. Now, while I think that's great, I think the one thing that is a potential problem is that has a shelf life. You know, Gibson is big on going, you know, back to the 50s and 60s. That's all they talk about. And they're really proud of that, as they should be. They got it right, you know, a long time ago. But I feel like as this generation of players, the older generation, you know, I feel like my generation and kids even younger are really not going to want to play Les Pauls anymore if they continue to be, you know, the old school guitars. You always got to reinvent yourself. You always got to cater towards the modern player. And I think these could potentially have a shelf life, because if you're only talking about what you did, you know, in the 50s and the 60s, it's like, man, what are you doing in the modern time? You know, let's talk about how, like, what I'm saying is this, like, I want you, meaning Gibson, I want Gibson to be excited about what they're doing in the modern time. Like, you know, be proud of that, as you should be. You know what I mean? Like, I feel like just constantly reminding the audience and reminding customers and consumers that, hey, we did awesome in the 50s and the 60s. I feel like it's gonna be like, yeah, but like, you know, what about today? Like, let's talk about, you know, the modern times, 2021, 2022. You know, there's no shame in being proud of what you're doing in today's day and age. You know, the 50s and 60s is great, but you know, let's continue. Like, let's evolve. Let's move on. Let's move past that. You see what I'm saying? I just feel like there's like hanging on to the 50s and 60s is cool. It's great, but it's like, you know, in my opinion, I feel like that can't be your end-all be-all, because basically what that says to me, or what that says to the customers, it's like, we're not going to do anything different ever again, and I think that's going to have a shelf life. So that's like my hot take, and that's like a potential problem I see, again, being a fan and a customer of Gibson for years now. Yeah, it's just like, I feel like that could potentially have a shelf life. But now, let me spin it at a big positive. Like I said in the intro, man, this is my favorite model, my favorite everything with a guitar. It has been ever since I was a little kid, and it probably will be forever. I saw in a Slash interview one time, he said, I wake up every day and I look at the Les Paul, and I've never said, like, that's not cool looking. Like, I always say this thing is cool looking, pointing to one of his guitars. And I completely agree, man. Like, I think this is like the epitome of what a cool guitar looks like. This will always be cool to me, and I'm a huge fan, and I'm always going to be a fan, even if I disagree with some of the things that they do, right? The vibe, the history, you know, anybody who was anybody back in the day playing, you know, guitar had a Les Paul. Les Pauls were once really, really cool, and they're kind of like polarizing nowadays, but man, like, I love these things, man. And I feel like because I love them so much and I've had them in my life for 20 years now, even before I could play guitar, they were just always around. I feel comfortable enough to be able to speak on them and talk about the things that I don't necessarily like, but at the end of the day, kind of just like be okay with how they are and, you know, the imperfections and, you know, whatever. It's just all about a vibe. It's about a look. It's about an aesthetic. It's about rock and roll. It ain't always going to be perfect, and you don't always need to have a perfect guitar. I'm not perfect. These aren't perfect, but at the end of the day, I still love them, you know, all the same. Does that make sense? So, ladies and gentlemen, those are some of the things that I just kind of hate about the Les Paul, man. You know, I love them to death, but they're flawed as hell, and, you know, at the end of the day, that's okay. As long as we can accept the flaws and still jam on them, that's all cool by me, man. So, again, if you want to play along, leave your thoughts down below about the Les Paul, things that you may like and or not like about them, and I'll meet you down there and we'll mix it up, okay? Again, if you're brand new to my channel, please consider hitting that subscribe button. I'd really appreciate it. I'm out of here. Stay safe, stay healthy, stay metal, and I'll see you guys next time. Later.